In the late summer of 2023, a set of grizzly bear tracks was discovered in a drainage system in the southern Wind River Range of Wyoming, approximately 120 kilometers south of where wildlife managers had believed the Yellowstone grizzly bear population's effective range ended. The tracks were confirmed by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service personnel. They were not ambiguous. Grizzly bear tracks have a morphology that distinguishes them clearly from black bear tracks, specifically in the shape of the toe pad arrangement. If what you just heard makes you want to keep going, stay here. This is exactly the kind of content we make, and there is a lot more of it. Subscribe now so you do not miss what comes next. The relatively straight line of the toe tips compared to the arc characteristic of black bears, and the consistent registration of claw marks at a distance from the toes that reflects the grizzly's longer, less curved front claws. The tracks were grizzly. The location was, by any measure that wildlife managers had been using to define the boundary of the recovered Yellowstone ecosystem grizzly bear population, extraordinary. It represented the southernmost confirmed grizzly bear presence in Wyoming since the recovery effort that began in the late 1970s following the species listing under the Endangered Species Act. It was 120 kilometers beyond the point that had functioned in the working geography of grizzly bear management as the southern edge of realistic occurrence. The incident received coverage in regional wildlife news outlets and generated a brief discussion among conservation and hunting communities before fading from broader attention. Wildlife managers issued statements emphasizing the positive conservation implications of a recovered population expanding into new terrain. The language was carefully chosen and genuinely reflective of one dimension of what the event represented. A grizzly bear, appearing 120 kilometers south of the established range boundary, is, from the perspective of a species that was reduced to fewer than 150 individuals in the Yellowstone ecosystem in 1975, an extraordinary conservation success. The population has grown. The animals are moving. The recovery is real, in a way that it was not certain to be when the first management plans were written. That story is true and important. It deserves to be told accurately. What does not get told alongside it, in the official communications and the brief coverage that follows discoveries like this one, is the full texture of what range expansion by a recovered grizzly bear population means, what it changes, what it puts into contact with what, and why the geography of that expansion is not a simple good news story requiring only celebration. It is a story with a complexity that the good news framing consistently flattens, and the flattening is doing something specific to the public's ability to understand what is actually happening in the mountains and forests of the American West. If that kind of analysis interests you, if you want to understand wildlife stories at the level beneath the press release, then stay with this, because what follows goes places that the standard coverage of this event did not. The baseline facts about grizzly bear recovery in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem deserve to be stated with the fullness they earn, because they are genuinely remarkable facts that require decades of difficult, expensive, politically contentious work to produce. In 1975, when the grizzly bear was listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act, the Yellowstone population was estimated at somewhere between 136 and 312 individuals, with the lower end of that range probably closer to the biological reality. The population occupied a contracted range, pressured by a century of active killing that included federal predator control programs, sport hunting without population assessment, and the straightforward elimination of bears that came into conflict with ranching and agricultural operations throughout the region. The demographic signature of a population in serious trouble was present in the data. Reproduction rates were not compensating for mortality. Adult females, the demographic that most directly drives population trajectory in a species with slow reproductive rates like grizzly bears, were being killed at rates that pushed the population's growth rate below replacement. The species was, by the standards of population viability analysis, on a trajectory that did not have a good destination. What happened after 1975 was not automatic. The Endangered Species Act listing provided legal protection, but legal protection is a framework, not an outcome. Converting the framework into an actual recovered population required the Interagency Grizzly Bear Study Team, formed in 1973 and operational through the listing and beyond, to develop monitoring infrastructure that could track population trends in a species that ranges across thousands of square kilometers of roadless wilderness, reproduces slowly, and is extraordinarily difficult to count. It required the development of management protocols that reduced human-caused mortality, the dominant driver of population decline, through bear-aware food storage requirements, aversive conditioning programs, conflict response guidelines, and the hard political work of getting federal land management agencies, state wildlife agencies, the livestock industry, and local communities to implement practices that reduced the frequency of lethal conflicts. It required, perhaps most importantly, the willingness of wildlife managers to hold the line on grizzly bear protection through periods of intense political pressure from constituencies that had significant economic and cultural reasons to prefer a smaller grizzly bear population or none at all. The recovery indicators began moving in the right direction in the late 1980s and continued moving through the 1990s and 2000s. The population estimate for the Yellowstone ecosystem grizzly bear population crossed 500 individuals sometime in the early 2000s and continued growing. By the most recent comprehensive assessments, the population is estimated at between 700 and 1,000 individuals, though the uncertainty around that estimate reflects the genuine difficulty of counting bears in the kind of terrain they occupy. The recovery zone, defined as the area around the core of Yellowstone and Grand Teton National Parks that has been the focus of management and monitoring, has seen grizzly bears reoccupy portions of their historical range that had been functionally vacant for decades. Bears have been documented in areas of the Bridger-Teton National Forest, the Shoshone National Forest, and the Caribou-Targhee National Forest, where they had not been confirmed in the living memory of the people who work those lands. The population is, by every available metric, recovered in the demographic sense. It is not recovered in the geographic sense. The range that grizzly bears occupy today in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem is substantially smaller than the range they occupied before European settlement. The question of what recovery means in terms of range, in terms of where on the landscape a recovered population should be expected to exist, and does exist, is not settled. It is one of the live questions that the 2023 discovery in the southern Wind Rivers forces back to the surface. Understanding why a grizzly bear appeared 120 kilometers south of the established range boundary requires understanding something about grizzly bear dispersal biology and the demographic mechanics of a growing population. Grizzly bears are not territorially fixed in the way that some predator species are. Adult females establish home ranges that they maintain with some consistency over multiple years, but the ranges are large, often covering hundreds of square kilometers, and they shift in response to food availability. Adult males have even larger ranges and move more extensively. Subadult males, the demographic most likely to appear at the leading edge of range expansion, are the most mobile of all. When a grizzly bear population grows beyond the carrying capacity of its core range, it produces a surplus of young animals, primarily males, that must either find space within the existing range by displacing residents or move. The physics of a growing, spatially limited population push outward at the margins. Subadult males are the demographic most often found at those margins. The animals that show up in places where grizzly bears have not been recently confirmed, that trigger the trail cameras and the track discoveries, and the livestock depredation reports that mark the leading edge of expansion. The Southern Wind River Range is a specific geographic context that helps explain why the 2023 tracks appeared where they did. The Wind River Range is a major mountain chain running roughly northwest to southeast through west-central Wyoming. Its northern end connects, through a series of mountain ranges and intervening valleys, to the core Grizzly Bear Range around Yellowstone. The connection is not seamless. There are gaps, highway crossings, agricultural valleys, and developed areas that impose real costs on animals moving south. But the landscape between the Yellowstone core and the northern wind rivers is not the equivalent of the freeway-bisected landscape of suburban Southern California. It is, in large portions, federal land, national forest, and Bureau of Land Management terrain, with relatively low road density, substantial wild ungulate populations, and the kind of structural characteristics that grizzly bears can navigate during dispersal. Animals have been making that northernmost section of the journey for years. The documented range of the Yellowstone population had crept southward over multiple survey cycles as more individuals were confirmed further from the core. The 2023 discovery did not come from nowhere. It came from the end of a trend line that had been moving south for years. It just moved further south, faster, than the previous detections had prepared managers to expect. The 120-kilometer figure is the number that matters most for what comes next, and it matters not because of what it tells us about where grizzly bears have been, but because of what it implies about where they are going. The Southern Wind River Range does not terminate at a natural barrier that grizzly bears cannot cross. It continues south and eventually transitions into a series of mountain ranges and high desert terrain that extends across the Wyoming-Colorado border. To the west, the terrain connects through the Wyoming Range and the Salt River Range to the Bear River drainage and eventually to the Uinta Mountains of northeastern Utah and northwestern Colorado. To the east, the terrain transitions toward the Laramie Range and the mountain blocks of central and northern Colorado. These are not all grizzly bear habitat of equivalent quality. They vary enormously in prey availability, human use intensity, road density, and the structural characteristics that determine how well a large omnivore can meet its energetic needs. But they are terrain that a dispersing grizzly bear can move through, and some of them are terrain where grizzly bears historically lived before the 19th century campaign of extirpation removed them. The last confirmed grizzly bear in Colorado was killed in 1979 in the South San Juan wilderness by an outfitter who was attacked while butchering an elk. That animal was, by DNA and morphological assessment conducted on the trophy after the kill, a genuine grizzly. It was female. Its presence in Colorado in 1979, decades after the species was presumed extirpated from the state, suggested that a small remnant population had been persisting in the remote terrain of the San Juan Mountains, undetected or unreported, long after the official extinction date. Whether any other individuals survived into the 1980s is unknown. No confirmed grizzly bear has been documented in Colorado since. The question of whether grizzly bears will naturally recolonize Colorado has been a theoretical discussion for decades. The 2023 tracks in the southern wind rivers make it somewhat less theoretical. The animal that left those tracks was approximately 600 kilometers from the San Juans, still a vast and difficult distance, but the direction of movement and the rate of expansion in the Yellowstone population mean that the distance is shrinking on a human-relevant timescale. The question that the official communications about the 2023 discovery carefully avoided is the question that everyone with a working knowledge of Western landscape ecology and grizzly bear biology is actually thinking about, which is not whether this is a conservation success. It clearly is. The question is, what a naturally recovering grizzly bear population expanding southward through terrain that has not had grizzlies for 3 to 5 generations of human residents means for the people, the land uses, the livestock operations, the recreation infrastructure, and the communities that have organized themselves in the absence of grizzly bears and that will have to reorganize, in ways large and small, if grizzly bears become a permanent, breeding presence in terrain where they have not been for a very long time. This is not a question that has a single answer. It is a question that has different answers depending on where you are asking it, what your relationship to the land is, what you use it for, what your history with it is, and what you understand about grizzly bear ecology and behavior. The rancher running cattle on Forest Service allotments in the southern Wind Rivers has a set of answers that are not identical to the backpacker who spends 2 weeks each summer in the same terrain. The elk outfitter who has been operating in the area for 30 years has answers that are not identical to the wildlife biologist who studies large carnivore ecology. None of these people are wrong about what they are responding to. They are all responding to real things, real costs, real risks, real changes in their operational reality. What is less consistent is the degree to which the public communications surrounding grizzly bear range expansion create space for those different realities to be acknowledged honestly, rather than being collapsed into either the triumphalist conservation narrative of a species coming back from the brink, or the equally simplified counter-narrative of dangerous predators invading working landscapes and threatening human safety. The human safety question is the one that generates the most heat and the least light in public discussions of grizzly bear expansion. And it deserves careful treatment here, because the careful treatment is what is almost never provided. Grizzly bears kill people. This is a biological fact about a large apex predator that has co-evolved with prey species over millions of years, and that is fully capable of killing a human being with a single swipe of a forepaw. The number of people killed by grizzly bears in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem since systematic records began is small but not negligible. Between 1975 and 2023, approximately 10 people were killed by grizzly bears in the Yellowstone area. Additional fatalities have occurred in the grizzly bear range of Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming, outside the core Yellowstone zone. In Alaska, where grizzly bears exist at much higher densities and where human recreational and subsistence use of grizzly habitat is also intense, the mortality record is more substantial. The Yellowstone-specific numbers are the relevant baseline for what the southern Wind River's expansion means in safety terms, because the animals in question are from that population and will carry the behavioral characteristics of that population into new terrain. What makes the Yellowstone grizzly bear's safety profile different from the mountain lion safety profile is the nature of the attacks. Mountain lion attacks on humans follow a pattern dominated by predatory behavior. Attacks on individuals who are perceived as prey, driven by the mechanisms described in the behavioral analysis of that species. Grizzly bear attacks on humans in the Yellowstone ecosystem follow a different pattern. The majority of documented grizzly bear attacks on humans in that region are defensive. A hiker or hunter encounters a bear at close range. The bear perceives a threat, and the bear responds with an attack that is defensive in motivation rather than predatory. Defensive attacks by grizzly bears are typically shorter in duration and lower in lethality than predatory attacks, because the bear's goal is to neutralize the perceived threat, not to kill and consume prey. Bears engaged in defensive attacks frequently disengage and retreat once the human stops resisting, which is the basis for the counterintuitive but well-documented guidance that playing dead, lying flat on your stomach with hands clasped behind your neck, reduces mortality in defensive grizzly bear attacks. The guidance exploits the bear's motivation. A threat that stops moving and stops making threatening sounds has been neutralized from the bear's perspective. The attack has succeeded. The bear withdraws. Predatory grizzly bear attacks on humans are much rarer than defensive attacks and much more lethal. They occur primarily at night, when a bear approaches a sleeping human or a campsite with apparent intent to investigate or consume. The behavioral signature of a predatory grizzly bear attack is different from a defensive attack. The bear is persistent. It does not disengage when the human plays dead. It continues the attack. In documented predatory grizzly bear attacks, playing dead has been associated with increased mortality rather than decreased, because the behavior that terminates a defensive attack signals vulnerability to a predatory one. The guidance for predatory grizzly bear attacks is to fight back with everything available, to make noise, to resist aggressively, to use bear spray, to make the cost of the attack as high as possible for the bear. Distinguishing between a defensive and a predatory attack in the moment, with a large bear on top of you, is genuinely difficult. The guidance is probability-based. Most attacks are defensive. Play dead, and you survive most attacks. Fight back, and you potentially escalate a defensive attack while surviving a predatory one. These are real trade-offs in a genuinely dangerous situation. And the existence of these trade-offs is something that people who will be recreating an expanded grizzly bear range need to understand at a level more specific than the general statement that bear spray is effective. Bear spray is effective. This is one of the clearest findings in the grizzly bear attack literature. Bear spray, oleoresin capsicum aerosol, deployed in a directed stream at an approaching bear, has been documented in multiple studies as more effective than firearms at preventing grizzly bear attack injuries in close-range encounters. The mechanism is direct. The capsaicin compounds in bear spray cause immediate, intense, temporary pain and sensory disruption in the bear's eyes, nose, and respiratory system. The spray is deployed at close range, typically within 10 meters, and creates a cloud that the approaching bear moves through, stopping the attack. Firearms require accuracy under extreme stress, require the right caliber to penetrate grizzly bear's skull and musculature in a way that produces immediate incapacitation, and have a documented failure rate in close-range bear encounters that is substantially higher than the advocates of firearm carry in bear country typically acknowledge. Bear spray is not a guarantee. Nothing in a grizzly bear encounter is a guarantee. But the data on relative effectiveness is consistent enough that anyone spending time in terrain where grizzly bears have been confirmed should be carrying it and should know how to use it. The 2023 discovery in the southern Wind Rivers means that the category of terrain where grizzly bears have been confirmed now extends further south than it did before. The circle of people who need to be thinking about bear spray and bear encounter protocols just got larger. The livestock and ranching dimension of grizzly bear range expansion is the dimension that generates the most sustained political conflict in the public management of the species, and it is worth understanding with some specificity because the conflict is not, at its root, about ideology or attitude toward wildlife. It is about economics and operational reality. Grizzly bears kill livestock. This is not occasional, and it is not trivial in its financial impact on individual operations. In the core grizzly bear range of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, confirmed grizzly bear depredations on livestock, including cattle, sheep, horses, and other stock, occur at a rate that produces significant annual losses. The United States Department of Agriculture's Wildlife Services Program and state wildlife agencies maintain depredation compensation programs that reimburse producers for confirmed grizzly bear kills at fair market value. The programs are imperfect. Confirmation requires finding the carcass and positively identifying grizzly bear sign, which in terrain with substantial scavenger pressure does not always happen before the evidence is consumed. The reimbursement rates are periodically disputed as inadequate relative to actual market values or to the secondary costs of depredation, including the time spent on carcass recovery, the stress on surviving animals, the disruption to grazing management, and the costs of implementing preventive measures like bear-resistant corrals, fladry, and range riders. Beyond the direct financial costs, grizzly bear presence in grazing allotments changes the operational reality of livestock production in ways that are not fully captured by depredation payment programs. Grazing management must be adjusted. Bedding locations must account for bear activity. Calving operations, which concentrate vulnerable small animals in areas that attract predators, require enhanced monitoring. The cumulative cost of these adjustments, in time, labor, and management complexity, falls on individual producers who may already be operating on thin margins in a commodity market that has not reliably rewarded the environmental and cultural complexity of public lands ranching. The political response from the ranching community to grizzly bear expansion is not simply an expression of anti-wildlife sentiment, though that sentiment exists in parts of the community. It is partly a rational response to a set of real costs being imposed by a federal management program on private businesses operating under federal permits without adequate compensation or operational support. The countervailing argument made by wildlife advocates and by the economic analysis that supports it is that grizzly bear recovery produces economic benefits to regional communities through wildlife-associated tourism and recreation that substantially exceed the costs of livestock depredation. The argument is supported by data at the regional scale. Yellowstone National Park generates billions of dollars in annual economic activity in the surrounding states, and the wildlife viewing opportunities, including grizzly bear viewing, are a primary driver of that visitation. Bear viewing operations in areas of relatively reliable grizzly bear occurrence generate significant revenue for local guides, outfitters, and hospitality businesses. The aggregate economic case for grizzly bear recovery is positive when viewed at the regional level. What the aggregate case does not do is distribute the costs and benefits of recovery equitably. The benefits accrue to tourism infrastructure, to national park adjacent businesses, to the general regional economy. The costs accrue disproportionately to specific livestock producers, to specific outfitters whose elk hunting clients are disturbed by or competing with bears, to specific individuals whose operations are located in the terrain where the bears are expanding. The mismatch between who bears the costs and who receives the benefits of grizzly bear recovery is a structural feature of the management system that compensation programs partially but not fully address, and it is a source of sustained conflict that will intensify as the range expands into areas where the existing infrastructure for coexistence has not been developed. The hunting community's relationship to grizzly bear recovery is more complex than either advocacy framing or anti-conservation framing captures. Hunters are, as a demographic, not uniformly opposed to grizzly bear recovery. Many hunters actively support large carnivore conservation as part of a broader commitment to wild landscapes and wild prey populations. The organizations that fund wildlife conservation through the federal excise tax on hunting equipment and licenses have contributed substantially to the habitat and prey base that supports grizzly bear recovery. The complexity enters through the competition between grizzly bears and hunters for the ungulate prey species that both pursue. Grizzly bears in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem prey on elk, bison, deer, moose, and pronghorn, as well as on whitebark pine nuts, cutthroat trout, ground squirrels, and the diverse plant foods that constitute the omnivore's diet. In years of high bear density and concentrated elk calving areas, grizzly bear predation on elk calves is measurable in the calf recruitment data. Hunters in the Yellowstone region particularly those pursuing elk on foot in backcountry terrain, compete with grizzly bears in a more immediate way as well. The practice of field dressing elk in the backcountry, leaving gut piles and sometimes quarters cached in the field overnight, creates grizzly bear attractants that result in frequent encounters at close range, encounters that carry real injury risk, and that have produced a number of the serious grizzly bear attacks on hunters in the documented record. The encounter type, a hunter kneeling over a freshly killed elk at close range when a grizzly bear arrives to investigate the blood and gut pile, represents a convergence of factors that produces elevated attack risk. The bear is food-motivated and therefore more persistent than a casually encountered animal. The hunter is in a crouched, low posture that may be less behaviorally assertive to the bear than a standing human. The hunter may be armed, but the encounter may happen at a range and in a sequence that does not allow a clean firearm shot before the bear makes contact. Bear spray is the appropriate tool for this encounter type, and the hunting community's adoption of bear spray as standard equipment has been growing in grizzly bear range, but is not yet universal. The expansion of grizzly bear range into terrain where hunters have been operating without significant bear encounter risk means that the calculus of hunting preparation in those areas is changing, and the hunting community in the southern Wind Rivers and adjacent terrain is going to have to engage with that change whether or not the official communications about the range expansion explicitly frame it in those terms. The recreation community's relationship to expanding grizzly bear range is a version of the same adjustment process, scaled to a much larger population of users with much more varied levels of wilderness experience and preparation. The Greater Yellowstone ecosystem already has a substantial infrastructure of bear-aware recreation guidance, education, and regulation. Backcountry permits in Yellowstone and Grand Teton National Parks include bear safety information. Food storage regulations requiring bear canisters or approved hanging methods are enforced in backcountry zones. The trailhead signage in core grizzly bear areas is extensive. The result is not zero incidents, but it is a recreation culture that has been shaped by decades of managed coexistence with grizzly bears and that has internalized a baseline level of bear awareness that is qualitatively different from what exists in terrain where grizzly bears have not been present in living memory. The southern Wind Rivers, for all their remoteness and wild character, are heavily used by recreational hikers, backpackers, climbers, and anglers. The Cirque of the Towers, one of the most spectacular alpine destinations in the American West, draws thousands of visitors each summer. The range as a whole supports a significant backcountry recreation economy. The people who use it come from across the country and bring varying levels of wildlife awareness and preparation. The 2023 tracks were discovered in a drainage below the elevation bands that see the heaviest recreation use. But the relevant point is not where one bear was on one day. The relevant point is what a confirmed grizzly bear presence at this southerly position implies about where bears may be moving in subsequent seasons, and whether the recreation community using this terrain is prepared for the encounter types that grizzly bear presence produces. Bear spray is not universally carried in the southern Wind Rivers. Food storage practices appropriate for black bear country are not identical to those needed for grizzly bear country. The behavioral protocols for encounters with habituated or predatory grizzly bears are not the same as the protocols for black bear encounters, and many backcountry users in terrain where black bears are the only large carnivore have learned black bear protocols and not grizzly bear protocols. These gaps are not gaps in wildlife management. They are gaps in public education that have a real bearing on safety outcomes in terrain where the carnivore community is changing. The food storage question is worth dwelling on specifically because it reveals a material difference between grizzly bears and black bears that the recreation community's existing education infrastructure does not always make adequately clear. Black bears are intelligent, opportunistic, and capable of learning that human food sources are available in camping areas. They can be persistent and destructive in their pursuit of improperly stored food. But the behavioral response of a black bear confronted by an assertive human defending a food cache is generally to withdraw. Black bears are, in the wild, relatively risk-averse about confrontational situations with humans. The behavioral protocol for a black bear at your campsite: stand tall, make noise, throw things, make yourself the more threatening party, generally works to drive the animal away. A grizzly bear at a campsite, particularly one that has been attracted by food and is food-motivated, is a different behavioral situation. Grizzlies are more likely to stand their ground in confrontations. They are more capable of sustaining an attack through a human's defensive response. The deterrent threshold that a human's assertive behavior represents is higher for a grizzly than for a black bear. This is not a reason to panic about grizzly bear presence. It is a reason to take food storage and campsite management more seriously than the black bear baseline requires, and to carry bear spray as a genuine defensive tool rather than an optional accessory. The white-bark pine connection is an element of grizzly bear ecology in the Yellowstone region that belongs in any honest discussion of range expansion and its drivers, because it introduces a level of ecological complexity that the simple narrative of a recovered population expanding its range does not capture. Whitebark pine seeds are a critical hyperphagia food for grizzly bears in the Yellowstone ecosystem. During the fall fattening period, when bears are accumulating the fat reserves that will sustain them through hibernation and through the demanding reproductive period of the following year, whitebark pine nuts in productive years constitute a major portion of their caloric intake. Grizzly bears in the greater Yellowstone region have been documented making extended movements to access whitebark pine stands at high elevation, and the annual availability of whitebark pine nuts is a significant predictor of grizzly bear body condition going into winter, and, consequently, of reproductive success. Whitebark pine across the greater Yellowstone ecosystem is in serious decline. White pine blister rust, a fungal pathogen introduced to North America from Europe in the early 20th century, has been killing whitebark pines at a rate that has dramatically reduced stand density across much of the species range in the northern Rockies. The mountain pine beetle, whose population explosions are facilitated by the warmer winters and drier summers produced by climate change, has compounded the blister rust mortality in ways that have left extensive areas of former whitebark pine forest as standing dead timber. The cumulative effect on the food web that grizzly bears depend on in the Yellowstone ecosystem is measurable. In years when whitebark pinecone production is low or absent, which is happening with increasing frequency as the surviving stands decline, grizzly bears switch to alternative food sources, including agricultural crops, livestock, and human-associated food sources in developed areas. The dietary stress produced by whitebark pine decline is not the primary driver of range expansion, but it is a background condition that interacts with population pressure to push bears into new terrain and toward new food sources. And it is a condition that will intensify as the climate-driven decline of whitebark pine continues. The decline of cutthroat trout in Yellowstone Lake, another historically important grizzly bear food source, represents a parallel disruption to the ecosystem services that have supported the recovered Yellowstone population. Lake trout, illegally introduced to Yellowstone Lake in the 1990s, have dramatically reduced the spawning run of cutthroat trout in the lake's tributary streams. Grizzly bears, osprey, otters, and a suite of other species that historically exploited the spawning cutthroat trout as a predictable, high-calorie food source during a critical period of the annual food cycle have all been affected. National Park Service management has invested significantly in lake trout suppression through gill netting, with documented effects on lake trout abundance, but the cutthroat trout population has not recovered to its pre-introduction level. The cumulative food stress on Yellowstone grizzly bears from the loss of whitebark pine nuts and reduced cutthroat trout availability represents a meaningful change in the caloric landscape of the core range, and it is a change that makes the demographic push toward range expansion more energetically understandable. Bears that are not meeting their caloric needs in the core range have stronger motivation to move than bears that are. The range expansion is not only a consequence of population size, it is also a consequence of a food resource base in the core range that is under pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. Against this ecological background, the management debate about grizzly bear delisting, the process by which the species would be removed from the federal threatened species list and returned to state management, is a debate that looks different than it does in the stripped-down form in which it is usually presented. Delisting has been attempted and blocked by federal courts twice, once under the Bush administration in 2007 and once under the Trump administration in 2017. Both delisting rules were vacated by federal courts on procedural and substantive grounds. The 2017 rule was vacated in part because the court found that the recovery criteria for the Yellowstone population had not adequately accounted for the significant connection between whitebark pine availability and grizzly bear survival and reproduction. That finding is biologically significant. The federal government's scientists had determined that the population had recovered to a sufficient level to justify removal from the list. Federal courts had found that the recovery criteria themselves were inadequate because they did not account for a changing food base. The gap between those two positions reflects a genuine scientific and policy dispute about what recovery means in a changing ecosystem. A dispute that the standard delisting framework, designed around the concept of a recovered population in a stable environment, is not well structured to resolve. The states of Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho have consistently supported delisting and have had management plans ready to implement regulated sport hunting of grizzly bears upon delisting. The rationale from the state wildlife management perspective is that a population that has grown to several hundred or more individuals in the Yellowstone ecosystem has exceeded the recovery targets set in the original recovery plan and can be managed as a game species, with hunting as a population control tool, consistent with the model used for other recovered large carnivores like wolves. The counter-argument from conservation organizations and from the federal court decisions that have blocked delisting is that the population's long-term viability is not assured in a way that justifies reducing the legal protections that have enabled the recovery, particularly given the food resource uncertainties and the genetic connectivity limitations of an isolated population. Both positions are grounded in real concerns. The state management position reflects a genuine belief that regulated hunting is a legitimate and effective wildlife management tool that does not threaten the population's viability at current numbers. The conservation position reflects a genuine concern that the population's ecological context is deteriorating in ways that make current numbers a less reliable indicator of future viability than they would be in a stable ecosystem. The delisting debate intersects with the range expansion story in a specific way that is rarely discussed. The grizzly bear that left tracks in the southern Wind Rivers was not in a location covered by any existing state management plan for grizzly bears. Wyoming's management framework for grizzly bears is organized around the greater Yellowstone ecosystem and the formal recovery zone established around it. A bear 120 kilometers south of that zone is in terrain where the state's existing management infrastructure for grizzly bears is not designed to operate, where there are no established livestock compensation programs for grizzly bear depredations, no specific recreation education programs about grizzly bear encounters, no depredation response protocols calibrated to grizzly bears rather than black bears. The management gap that range expansion creates is not theoretical. It is practical and immediate. If grizzly bears begin to establish regular presence in the southern wind rivers and adjacent terrain, the state and federal agencies responsible for wildlife management in that terrain will need to develop management infrastructure that does not currently exist. The resource requirements, political commitments, and institutional coordination that implies represent a significant undertaking that has not been formally initiated, and the gap between the pace of range expansion and the pace of management infrastructure development is the kind of gap that produces bad outcomes when it is not closed proactively. The ranching operations in the terrains south of the established grizzly bear range are not currently operating with grizzly bear coexistence practices in place. This is not a criticism. There has been no grizzly bear presence in that terrain in living memory. The producers running livestock in the drainages of the southern wind rivers and the adjacent ranges are managing for black bear encounters, which require different infrastructure and different protocols. The transition from black bear country to country with confirmed grizzly bear presence is not operationally trivial. It requires changes to livestock handling practices, to range rider coverage, to carcass management, to infrastructure investment in exclusion devices. It requires access to a compensation program for confirmed grizzly bear depredations that is currently not available in terrain this far south of the existing recovery zone. The lead time between confirming grizzly bear presence in new terrain and having the management infrastructure in place to support coexistence in that terrain is measured in years, not months. The 2023 discovery suggests that the clock is running. The wilderness character of the southern wind rivers is a factor in this analysis that cuts in multiple directions simultaneously. The Wind River Range includes some of the largest contiguous roadless wilderness in the lower 48 states. The Bridger Wilderness on the west side of the range and the Fitzpatrick Wilderness on the east side together encompass nearly 800,000 acres of federally designated wilderness. The terrain is rugged, the human access is limited relative to the area, and the wild ungulate populations, primarily elk, mule deer, and pronghorn in the lower reaches and bighorn sheep in the alpine zones, are substantial. From the perspective of grizzly bear habitat quality, the southern wind rivers are considerably more favorable than much of the terrain where range expansion is occurring in the populated valleys and agricultural lowlands north of the range. A grizzly bear moving through the southern wind rivers has access to prey, to relatively undisturbed habitat, and to elevational gradients that allow seasonal movement between food sources in a way that approximates, more closely than most expansion terrain, the ecological conditions of the core Yellowstone range. If the objective is to have grizzly bears establish a sustainable presence south of the established recovery zone, the southern wind rivers represent a plausible location for that to begin. The complications are not habitat complications. They are human dimension complications. Wilderness designation does not mean uninhabited. The Wind River Range is intensively used for backcountry recreation. The range is also bounded by private land, by grazing allotments, by a significant big game outfitting industry, and by communities whose economies are tied to access to the range for hunting and recreation. The Shoshone and Arapaho tribes of the Wind River Indian Reservation, whose territory borders the east side of the range and who have treaty rights to hunt and gather in the off-reservation territory of the Wind Rivers, have a relationship to wildlife in this landscape that is sovereign, that predates the current federal management framework, and that any comprehensive management response to grizzly bear range expansion into this terrain must engage with honestly and substantively. Tribal perspectives on grizzly bear presence are not uniform, but the tribe's legal status as co-managers of wildlife resources in treaty territory gives them a formal role in management decisions that is not equivalent to any other stakeholder, and the specific cultural and spiritual significance of the grizzly bear in several of the plains and Great Basin cultures represented in the region adds a dimension to the question of grizzly bear presence that cannot be reduced to the standard cost-benefit framing of the coexistence debate. The DNA question is one that appears less frequently in public discussions than it should, given its implications for how the management community understands what it is dealing with when grizzly bears appear at the margins of the current recovery zone. Forensic genetic analysis of hair samples collected at rub trees, scat samples collected along movement corridors, and tissue samples from depredation events has generated a detailed picture of the genetic structure of the greater Yellowstone grizzly bear population. The picture reveals what population biologists have been documenting for over a decade. The Yellowstone population is genetically isolated. The nearest significant grizzly bear population, the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem population centered on Glacier National Park in Montana, is separated from the Yellowstone population by a stretch of terrain, the mountain ranges and agricultural valleys between the two ecosystems that grizzly bears rarely cross. The genetic exchange between the two populations is minimal. The heterozygosity indices for the Yellowstone population have been declining over successive monitoring cycles, reflecting the inbreeding that accumulates in any isolated breeding population over generations. The genetic isolation of the Yellowstone population has several implications for understanding range expansion at the southern margin. The animals expanding southward are part of a genetically isolated population. They are not bringing novel genetic material from external populations into the expansion zone. If grizzly bears establish a breeding presence south of the existing recovery zone, they will initially represent an extension of the genetically isolated Yellowstone lineage rather than a new population with meaningfully different genetic composition. Over time, if the southern population grows and potentially connects with other populations, the genetic dynamics could change. But on the time scale of the near future, what the expansion creates is a peripheral extension of a population that is already showing genetic stress, not a genetically robust, new founding population. This matters for long-term population viability assessments that will eventually need to be made for the expanded range. The question of what it takes for grizzly bears to actually establish a breeding presence in new terrain as opposed to passing through it is a question that the 2023 discovery cannot by itself answer. A single set of tracks, almost certainly from a subadult male, is evidence of a bear in a location. It is not evidence of a resident female, which is the demographic unit necessary for the establishment of a self-sustaining breeding presence. Female grizzly bears have substantially smaller home ranges than males and are much less likely to make the long-distance disperse.